And without further ado, let's get to our plenary for this morning. So I have the pleasure to announce Dr. Candace Hargan as our plenary speaker this morning. Dr. Hargan is an associate professor in the Department of Education, School, and Counseling at the University of Kentucky. She has her PhD from the University of Georgia, and she directs the RISE Squared research team, where they study sex, social justice, and leadership, all with a love ethic. And she'll be talking with us more about that this morning. So without further ado, let's welcome our first plenary speaker.
Thank you. Hey, y'all. I'm going to lower this down for the small but mighty. So thank you so much for having me today. By show of hands, who is a fan of hip-hop music? By show of applause, who's a fan of hip-hop music? So I saw a lot of hands. Okay. Wonderful, wonderful. Just shout out some of your favorite songs. We're going to work on that. We're going to work on that for y'all. So I love hip-hop, always have, and the way I'm thinking about this talk today is hip-hop is one form of sex science that we have the opportunity to investigate as sex scientists, and hot girl science is a paradigm through which we can do that. So this is really going to be a conversation, some stories, and some science together. And I dedicate this talk to Tanya Crowell, my favorite hot girl and my aunt. She was the one who very early in my life introduced me to hip hop and all of the ways that it could be informative to my sexual development. So I miss her and I'm grateful for her presence with me in this talk. This is what I'm going to walk you through, let you know what hot girl science is, and how you can use these criteria to inform your science. And you'll be able to also critique Black sexology research for its adherence to this paradigm that I introduced you to. So now that we got through that, let's get into the story. Because my K through 12 schools did not have comprehensive sex education, these were my formative sex educators. The top left, you will find a garbage bag. You know what was in that garbage bag? VHS tapes, because that's how old I am. Under my grandfather's bed or tucked in the closet with porn. Yes. Just give me a round of applause if porn was a part of your sex education. For better or for worse, it taught us some things, right? Sometimes, mostly for worse, but hey, I like it, you know. All right, bottom left, we've got the Holy Bible. So we've got grandfather with the porn, grandmother with the Holy Bible. How y'all married for 50 years? Let's figure this out, right? So this sex discourse was around abstinence only, keeping your legs closed, all of these narratives around women, especially girls, not having sex. Mind you, 8 children, but that's the conversation and the limits of the conversation in that. Top right corner, you've got the Encyclopedia Britannica. Just give me a round of applause if you had Encyclopedia Britannica in your house. Yes. So we had the set of Encyclopedia Britannica, and that is where I was able to find out about reproductive health for the first time, because I was so excited about puberty and getting boobs one day. And I just wanted to figure out what was going on, what was going to happen to my body. So the Encyclopedia Britannica was my more scientific medical option. And then bottom right, you got Lil' Kim. Yes, come on with the hoot. Give me a round of applause if you listen to Lil' Kim. Yes. And so her liberation, sex positive ethic around rap and hip hop music was informative to me. All 4 of these shaped for me what I came to know as my sexual self-awareness, my sexual development. And they also shape the way I do science now. So we're thinking about K through 12 being exposed to all of these and this integration of messages, all conflicting. You can imagine I had a lot of fun figuring it out. So So in the middle, I will tell you a brief story, and then I'll have my DJ over there press play so I can give you a little intro to this hot girl paradigm. 1999 was the year. 16-year-old Candace wanted to be a rapper, don't judge me. So it was the Rough Riders and Cash Money Millionaires hip-hop concert in the Civic Center of Atlanta. And yes, and at the middle of the concert, the MC gets on the stage and he's like, who want to get a record deal? I'm like, I want to get a record deal. My friends were like, no, girl, don't do it. Don't go up there. I was like, I'm doing it. I'm going up there. So I make my way to this stage with thousands of people on it. And I start my little rhyme. About 2.5 seconds later, I hear a machine gun soundtrack shooting my rap career down to the ground. Kind of get Sandman ushered off the stage. And my husband is like, and that is the moment you became Dr. Candace Nicole. It is indeed the year that I decided I wanted to be a psychologist, when I realized that hip hop was not going to be the career pathway for me. But the song of the year was Hot Girl. So can you play that for me, DJ? Just a little clip. Hey, hey. Y'all remember the early Lil Wayne. Nobody remembers Turk anymore.
I like them hot, the ones that don't tell me to stop, eat it up. And they know how to pop. I need a project chick, a hood red chick, one that don't really care. Say she took that shit with it. She go wobbly, that she know how to move with it. Screaming tight like she want me.
Was what I was doing at that concert in 1999.
Until I say, ooh, that's enough. Give me a gangster, be nice. One that don't give a damn and ashamed to be nice.
So, Hot Girl came not from Megan Thee Stallion, who I will cite frequently in this talk, but it came from the Hot Boys in that era. So I'm on the original path of Hot Girls. I'm probably a retired hot girl now, if I'm just going to be honest, with what my life looks like with a 2-year-old. But that's the path that I took to sex science. So I want to think through these hot girl hypotheses that I'm going to be presenting to you today. And I also want to frame it in the conversation of how sex science should be in communication with hip hop. And the first questions I have are for our Journal of Sex research editors. So as you're thinking about this talk, would you consider this paper for the journal? Who do you want your audience to be? And how do you want your journal articles to be used? Keep all of these contexts in mind. So just by round of applause, how many people have had desk rejections from JSR? Woohoo! Yes, I see some claps. It's a common thing, right? Rejection is a part of life. But I'll tell you about my experience. So 2017, 2019, 2021. The first one, this was on blacks, and this is too small to read. I'm just going to tell you what it is. This one was on the sex-positive pleasure narratives of black college students. This one was like, oh, your sample's too small. I'm a big Q qualitative researcher. Sample's too small. You only have 18 participants, and sometimes journals who don't have as many qualitative researchers on their editorial board might find that they don't know how to reach informational power or saturation. They don't know what that process might look like. So I was like, oh, okay. That one was published in another journal. 2019, this one was a little bit more stinging. I'll tell you, content analysis about black women's sexuality. And we're thinking about what type of message you get at the desk rejection, right? That means it doesn't go out for peer review. And so you ask, oh, what's wrong with this one? What's going on with this one? Well, you need a comparison group if you're going to talk about black women. Well, what would we need a comparison group for? Among who? To make what point? And you might also want to prune your language of emotion, and you're thinking, got published somewhere else. More recently, now we've been doing qualitative research for quite some time. This study, 454 participants, short-form qualitative data. I think this might be a better fit for a qualitative research journal. I'm like, okay, y'all, what do you want to do about black sexuality? So I want you to consider the conversations around black sexuality. that are happening in the marquee journal for this organization, and what that means for who shows up, who's cited, as it relates to Black sexuality research. And I'll give you some facts and figures about JSR and Black sexuality research a little bit later. So what is hot girl science? It's a liberation research paradigm. So if you think about post-positive research paradigms, those are the ones where you have a scientific premise, you pretend that you're objective, even though we know research probably isn't most of the time. You consider testing hypotheses, and then you have constructivist paradigms. Those are where you understand that you're going to co-construct reality, that the participants and the researchers both have subjective worldviews, they come together, you understand something as a phenomenon through construction. Then you have critical paradigms. Critical paradigms have an awareness of the power and oppression in systems, and they think about, how can we disrupt these power systems that are inequitable? How can we challenge the status quo? And then you have liberatory paradigms. Liberation paradigms take the work of the critical paradigms, the ones that understand the power, and say, well, what about the joy? What about the pleasure? What about the freedom? So hot girl science is a liberation paradigm built off of the multifaceted Black feminisms. And it has 4 criteria and 4 elements for you to consider as you undertake research with Black samples or alongside Black people. 1, we're going to talk about the criteria. 2, we're going to talk about the elements and then how they work together for hip-hop hypotheses. But first, you want to talk about these multifaceted Black feminisms. So if you consider these 4 parts of Black feminisms, you start with respectable Black feminisms. And I never disparage the early foremothers in Black sexuality research and Black feminist studies who were undergoing the violence of racist and sexist oppression and had to find a way to survive those systems for me to be here today. And so some of them chose the option of respectability politics. So although I don't endorse those and enact those in the way I do my work now, I understand those as a survival mechanism to get through that type of violence, to be at the table in some ways, to be some of the first to publish. So those are on the table as one point of entry. Then you have intersectional Black feminisms. This is where you get your Bell Hooks and your Patricia Hill Collins and your Kimberly Crenshaw, and they're like, you know what? We're not doing respectability anymore. We're thinking about how race and gender and sexual identity, all of these aspects of identity intersect and compound to make a matrix of domination. We're thinking about how Black women in particular experience the world, and we're centering their voices. I'm like, yes, let's bring that on. That's where my college was around that, at Spelman. Then we've got hip-hop feminisms. So hip-hop feminisms take us a bit further, and they're in conversation with intersectional Black feminisms because they say, okay, we understand the critical nature of all of these systems of oppression, but we still want to have sex, have fun, enjoy our lives. We still want to party, and we want to figure out how to be in that in-between space, how to live and not always be angry at the system, how to enjoy some of the aspects of our lives now. And hip-hop is a vehicle through which we can do that, even with its problems, even though it can sometimes be misogynistic and problematic, right? Those conversations are happening alongside hood feminism. So you're thinking about Kendall's recent work on hood feminism, which says, all right, you middle-class Black feminists who have access to the academy, don't forget about us. Don't forget about women who grew up in projects, the project chicks, the hood rat chicks, the ones who don't give a fuck, that whole thing that we just were introduced to with the hot boys. Hood feminism is asking us to be reminded that sometimes that's us. Sometimes that's our sisters, sometimes that's our cousins. And if you have a feminism that is elitist and privileged, even though you're looking at all of these other intersecting oppressions, you're gonna miss the mark. And so all of these feminisms come together in hip hop because hip hop is applied feminism, applied hip hop feminism through the lens of these Black women artists in particular. They think about what we've asked for in all of these Black feminisms, and they say, what will that look like in my music? And I can tell you for sure, in all of the sex research papers I wrote, none of them will ever be a platinum selling record, right? None of them will reach as many people as Cardi B's work. And so why would I not be in conversation with that applied form of feminism? And then we have our criteria. So there are 4. Drawn from Thee Stallion, 2019. We've got doing me unapologetically. And this means that you take an attitudinal posture of confidence, of courage, of power, and authenticity. If you're thinking about this from the standpoint of Black womanhood and you're in an academic space, it's a space that doesn't usually appreciate your ways of being in the world. The language you use, your disposition, your tone, all of these things are policed in this space. So when you choose doing me unapologetically as a function of your science, that means you're writing about the shit you want to write about, you're talking about the things you want to talk about, you're pushing the limits, and you're doing so from that position that I'm going to be authentic in this space to my values and my love ethic, even when the Academy scrutinizes Black women's ways of being. And then you've got having fun. So that's hard work. That's emotional labor to do you unapologetically in an academic space, especially when you're going up for tenure. But can you have fun doing it? So do you do research studies that facilitate joy? All last year on my research team, we started our meetings with a hip hop song or a sex song, right? And so we're starting it with a sex song and thinking about, what does this mean? I had each research team member pick a song, and I'm like, oh, look at, I like your little taste. I see where you're going with that. So we're starting with the laugh, starting with some fun. It's how we check in with each other. Does the research process facilitate joy? So are we doing it just so we can publish our work in high impact factor journals and have other people cite us, but it feels so emotionally taxing that it's not fulfilling at the end of the day? Or are we doing it in a way where we enjoy the process along with the output? Are the questions I ask and the products I create fun? So when you think about how you disseminate your research, I ask the type of questions that people who will never have access to the Academy want answered. That's why we do community-based research, so we can know, what do you want to know about this? What did Cardi B say about this? What did Meg say about this? And then we share and disseminate this research in outlets where Black women are, where Black people are, where Black femmes are. So one example of that is recently Therapy for Black Girls featured some of our work. And they said, they posted on their Instagram, 72% of Black women faked orgasm. The conversation was robust. When I tell you 600, 700 comments later, Black women were having this dialogue about their sexual lives, their orgasm faking frequency. Oh, that number's way too low. Oh, girl, no, that number is high, because not me, I won't be doing it. All of those conversations happening in ways that the journal article that I'm going to put out about that is not going to get, right? We might have some really robust conversations here, but it's not going to look like that. So, fun. Sex positivity. And most of you are familiar and well grounded in this, which is why I really appreciate this conference. It requires understanding that sex positive research should not just benefit people with privileged identities, right? You want to think about passion and desire and good sex and orgasms and intimacy and even sexual functioning about and with people with marginalized identities. And so sex positivity is asking us to do that, and that's what Hot Girl Science is inviting us to do as well. Am I studying and amplifying pleasure and sexual wellness holistically, especially when it comes to people with marginalized identities? Lastly, hyping up my friends. Hashtag Cite Black Women is already a movement, already a paper, already a product for research that you can cite as you choose to employ this practice. But this hyping up my friends is saying, am I citing Black women in my research, as well as anyone who is a friend in word and deed to Black women? And that word and deed are important, especially when you consider doing me unapologetically. Because you can say a lot of things about whether or not you're going to support Black women. But if your deeds don't match, then it's inauthentic. So these are the criteria that you're thinking about when you're doing and undertaking Hot Girl Science. And you're doing it through these elements. So your epistemology, how you know knowledge, how you understand knowledge, is intuitive and authoritative knowledge. Intuitive knowledge is like, you know when you just know something and you don't know how you know something? We really downplay the value of that in scientific inquiry. And there's a space for it if you allow it to be. There are some things you know because intuition is such a spectacular form of synthesizing knowledge. You've had access and exposure, you've read, you've experienced, you've lived, and your brain is so attuned to how to synthesize that you don't even remember how you know anymore. You just know, you just feel it in your gut. We recognize and value that as a way of knowing, as a form of knowledge, alongside authoritative knowledge, which is who is the expert in this area, who understands this, not just in lived experience, but in deep study. Combining those. Your ontology is how you understand how reality is shaped. We suggest that reality is shaped by context, as well as the level of power one has in a system and empowerment they experience themselves as having. So for example, in the academy, I think about, as a person who has racial and gender marginalization, I also have a lot of sense of empowerment and confidence. That means I'll transgress systems that don't even want me to be in them. I'll move the needle a bit so that the people who I mentor don't have to move that same needle. And I ask them, as I train them, to move the needle a little bit more so that the people they mentor don't have to move it, right? We push the boundary, we stretch the table, all of that. So not just the power one has in the system organizationally or societally, but also their sense of empowerment. That is a part of the ontology of hot girl science. Then you want to think about the methodologies. So how do you conduct? What are your procedures? Mixed methods, qualitative, and participatory action research methodologies in particular are a really great fit with hot girl science. We'd argue that quantitative research is an option, but only if your lived experience and identities reflect the participants you are studying. Why? Because you don't have the range. If you are not a member of that group, to analyze quantitative data about a group when you don't have community or relationship there. So you really need to draw on their authoritative knowledge in qualitative and mixed methods and participatory action ways to do that. Finally, you've got your exology. This is your ethics code, basically. How you understand what is right and what is not quite right. A love ethic by bell hooks is where we begin. And you think about other values that are born out of those multifaceted black feminisms I talked about. Emotions, enthusiasm, care, fun, joy, and pleasure. They have a central place in the ethics code of hot girl science. Further, nothing about us without us. It's unethical to undertake a study if you are not in community. So those are the ways that you can consider doing hot girl science and building it out. But let's talk about why it's necessary. So going back to what I was talking about in the rejection process, out of the 108 articles in this most recent issue of JSR, 4.6%, were about black people throughout the diaspora. That's black people in the United States, black people in Nigeria. Those were the articles. Not even all of them were written by black people as first author. So if we're thinking about expanding the way we know science, you've got to have an expansion on who we allow to be published in these scientific journals. And that's why hot girl science is important here. Further, STIs, HIV, unplanned pregnancy would not be a hit song, right? Nobody wants to sing that song. It's not gonna be a hit record. Like, it's just not gonna go. The same is true for the hundreds of sex science papers about black people that examine just these topics. These are important topics, but you cannot just do that because black people experience joy and pleasure, and sex science should reflect this. Multifaceted black feminisms invite us. They teach us about pleasure, worthiness in new ways. And so hot girl science is the paradigm through which we undertake some of these examinations. Lisa Bolag told you about it, and she was published in JSR when her Epistemologies of Ignorance in Studying Black Men's Sexuality paper came out. I think that was 2017. Lassiter most recently told you about this with colleagues when studying black people who are same-gender loving. I told you about it in Culture, Health, and Sexuality when studying Black women. And so now it's time for us to really listen and think through what that will look like. Because pleasure worthiness, as we come to know this construct we're building out with our hip-hop hypotheses, is so wonderful to consider. Feeling as if you deserve pleasure when racist stereotypes constantly suggest otherwise is resilient as fuck. Imagine a world that says you don't deserve to exist, you're not quite human, all these stereotypes about you, and you feel like you deserve a little pleasure anyway. Those of you with multiple marginalized identities, even if they're not racially marginalized identities, you know what that means. Black women hip-hop artists challenge these sex-negative cultural norms through their music as applied hip-hop feminisms. They give us pleasure worthiness on display in video. Cardi, Megan, City Girls, they set a standard of pleasure worthiness culturally. However, we always have to maintain that intersectional Black feminist lens. The premises they set forth in their songs have both liberation potential and they got some problematic context to them. We have to investigate these ideas, and sex scientists, that's where we come in. The Big Sex Study is a project that I'm undertaking with my colleague out here in the front, Dr. Shamika Thorpe. Yes, give her a round of applause. It's a mixed methods participatory action research project. It was beginning last year, January, February is when we did phase 1. So we surveyed 454 participants, Black people with a range of ethnic identities, sexual identities, ages, gender identities, and socioeconomic statuses. Surveyed them about sexual pleasure and desire and orgasm and masturbation and all of these fun things. And then phase 2 recently completed with interviews of 36 of those participants to deepen our knowledge about, well, what do we mean here? How do you understand these constructs that we found in the initial survey? What's good sex to you? What's sexual pleasure to you? What's sexual health to you? Digging a bit deeper. In our next phase, we're gonna have a conversation. So 3 to 4 focus groups with maybe 8 to 10 people in each of those focus groups, where we ask them to have a conversation with each other that we co-facilitate, where we're asking about these same topics, because the dialogue is where we deepen our knowledge even further. And I'm big Q qualitative research. So these last 2 aims, me, I got that. The first aim, all Dr. Thorpe. That's her jam and not my jam. But I had a great time learning with her. And so from that, we're going to do some of these analyses. 3 lines from 2 songs. I ain't lying about my nut just to make them happy. Broke boys don't deserve no pussy. And it never happened if the dick wasn't snapping. We're gonna find out what Cardi, Meg, and the City Girls have had to say, these premises they set forth in their applied hip-hop feminist scholarship, their songs, #1 records. And then we're gonna find out if it's true or not. All right, DJ, hook me up.
You'll never catch me calling these daddy. I ain't lying by my nut just to make a happy. Lifestyle winning, can't fit a magnum. It never happened if the wasn't snapping. I'm a hot girl.
Thank you. Now we got a new hot girl out, right? 99, we had an old school hot girl like myself. And now in 2021, we've got some new hot girls coming. But sex science says this might be a lie, Meg. Black people who sleep with men are indeed lying about our nuts. Black people, it's happening, y'all. I'm so sorry to say it. But Black people, men, women, trans men, all of the people in our sample who identified as having a male partner at last sexual experience were significantly more likely to report faking orgasm in their lifetime. Isn't that important knowledge there? We had to test it out because if you're thinking about 67% versus 33%, that's saying something. Meg is pushing the narrative on pleasure worthiness by saying, let's stop doing that, y'all. because that's not going to please us, but it's not yet translated into our cultural practice according to this sample. And so how do we translate what she's saying into action? We're going to talk about that. Let's go for the next one.
Bomb abs tight, rack stuck up shack height, jury on me flashlight. I've been listening last night, hit 'em with that good, make you wanna act right. Broke boys don't deserve no kitty. I know that's right.
Hey, I see y'all in the back. Thank you. I saw that and I love it, yes. So, sex science says this may also be a lie, Cardi and colleagues. Y'all tried it, and let me just say this. We know this is a classist premise, so I just want to name that, right? But black men don't report significant differences in the number of sex partners across the SES spectrum. There was a difference, but not a significant one, in that lower SES black men had more partners. And perhaps if we had a more diverse, socioeconomically diverse sample, we would have seen some significance in this. But most of the black men in our sample were middle class, and so we'll talk about what that means as far as income distribution in our sample and the limitations. But pleasure-worthiness, that construct that I introduced, that sense of pussy deservingness, was not correlated with class status either. So broke boys, in quotes, feel as deserving of pussy as their higher SES counterparts. They are getting plenty. And so I'm having this conversation with my research team when I'm going over the notes for the presentation. One of my students who identifies as a black man was like, right, that's what I'm talking about. And I'm like, oh, this touched your soul, didn't it? He was like, yeah, because they just be out here trying us. And I'm like, I know. We're not going to forward these premises around classism, right? We're going to challenge those problematic. We don't want to say that people who have low SES statuses shouldn't be having good sex. They should also be having good sex. So that's what we want to take away from this. And it never happened if the dick wasn't snapping. We already heard that little introduction. That was a part of the first one we heard from Megan Thee Stallion. But sex science says this one might be true, Meg. You're onto something here. Black people with higher frequency of faking orgasms reported fewer sex partners. There was a correlation there. Now, interestingly enough, if you consider black people who faked orgasms at 13.46 sex partners and black people who didn't around 19.69 sex partners, that one isn't significant if you're comparing the groups, but the correlation is. But the question we want to ask is, when the sex wasn't snapping, did they pretend it never happened, just not reporting it, and thus say, I didn't count this one because maybe I used to do that in college or maybe I didn't? Or I'm so worthy of pleasure that bad sex doesn't count, or sex is not orgasmic, so I don't engage as much. I have fewer partners. That's what the qualitative research is going to tell us. We're going to dig a little deeper into that and find out. But I was laughing because I was telling my husband, I was like, yeah, when I was in college, we used to just be like, oh, that one was terrible, it didn't count. We cared about stuff like that back then. We're going to push past that premise, right? So thinking about all of these, the construct of pleasure worthiness is really central here. Our black women hip hop artists are saying, we're worthy of pleasure. You're worthy of pleasure, girl. You're worthy of pleasure, black femme, black queer people. And reported pleasure worthiness among our sample was really high. A great deal is how most of our sample, over 300 people, rated their pleasure worthiness. Now, this was a single item, so there's some trouble with that. But to give you face value, that's how they reported it. However, exhibited pleasure worthiness was mixed. Low orgasm faking frequency? No, we didn't have that. High sexual pleasure scores? Yes, we had that. Positive perceptions of masturbation? That was mixed. These are some of the ways that you might evaluate exhibited pleasure worthiness, what that would look like in practice, basically. And here are some of the ways that our participants talked about it. So to me, it's just not about making the guy happy and things just end once the guy is done. This is one of our participants articulating her experience of pleasure worthiness. And that's important. We're seeing that in more research recently. For another woman, so my biggest influence, I feel like, was music. I think the songs made me want to experience what they were talking about. What you've painted seems like an awesome picture. I want to be a part of it. Even when I was in my current relationship and Megan Thee Stallion came out with her album, I was like, I want to be single and hoe it up again. This is the fun I'm having in research every day. I'm seeing snaps over there. I feel you. I wanted to experience what they were talking about. So it's always been the lyrics and how they talk about sex. I'm always like, oh, I'm intrigued. I want to know more, which is why we even drew on these hip hop hypotheses. We wanted to know what black people wanted to know. Another participant who identifies as a cis man said, I think learning how to be black is probably the first step in reclaiming for ourselves what sex can be for us. Shit, you spend the first 15 to 30 years being indoctrinated to hate yourself. And then you spend the next 15 to 30 years learning how to be black. So it's just one big reclamation process, loving ourselves enough to define ourselves while we're still dealing with this other shit. But loving ourselves enough to define ourselves enough to be able to say, okay, this is what I want sex to be for me. That's pleasure worthiness, right? In the face of racism. And lastly, one of our participants who identifies as genderqueer said, there's a bit of self-advocacy in sexual pleasure, in that if you don't say what you want, you're not gonna get what you want. That's really hard. I know that's definitely a thing that's really hard to learn, and that's definitely something that so societally we're told not to do. We're not told to advocate for our pleasure, especially if you're not a straight man, to say, this is what I want, this is what I'm comfortable doing, this is what makes me feel good. But advocating for sexual needs, that's pleasure worthiness. So with these data, I have some limitations and some invitations to make. Because reports of sexual pleasure and pleasure worthiness, were highly skewed, we couldn't use it as a mediator or moderator. And that means that so many people said, yes, I am worthy of pleasure, I'm pleasure worthy, that we need to find out what happens with people who are not and where we find them in our sample. Though we strive to recruit an economically diverse sample, we worked hard for that, we just didn't get it. And that's probably a function of the communities and partnerships we had with black sexologists, and that's who we partnered with in this research project. Our group was primarily college educated, and so that has some implications there. Still, this is an underrepresented group when it comes to sex science, because when it's black sexology, most people focus on low SES backgrounds, so people in urban areas who have low SES. We are introducing perhaps a new group into that. And then the questions and hypotheses were not set in advance. They were a response to calls to action from our communities and our research team discussions and the songs and hip hop. And so if we would set those hypotheses, perhaps the questions and the items we chose would have been a bit different. But here are our invitations. 1, sex science has an opportunity to cultivate a canon of empirical sex-positive research about and with black people that it has overwhelmingly rejected. Create guidelines, thank you. Create guidelines to assess for anti-black racism in the editorial and peer review process. Some people call it an equity audit, but you think about how many people submit, what are their racial identities of first author, what are the topics, and understand what that looks like over the next year. Really challenge yourselves around that. What about 2? The premises forwarded in hip hop, investigated through a hot girl science paradigm, give sex scientists credibility outside of the narrow scope of academia. Translate your research to broader audiences by partnering with sex-positive black community leaders, influencers, and organizations. Those partnerships have so much meaning to who gets access to this knowledge. If we know we're not getting comprehensive sex ed in most schools, we can really be a source of that through people who have way larger platforms than we do. Invitation 3, if we aim to recruit and retain black women as sex scientists, we need a sex science that welcomes our worldviews. So continue inviting black women to speak at the Quad S in plenary formats to amplify our contributions. Thank you, I appreciate the invitation to be here. Invitation 4, if we aim to make our research relevant for black people, We can't continue to focus overwhelmingly on risks and deficits. Sex research funders, the ones with the money, should prioritize the sponsorship of sex-positive Black sexual health projects alongside health disparities work. We know there's so much money in PrEP. There's so much money in HIV prevention. There's so much money in pregnancy. There's so much money in STIs. So much money, y'all, like millions and millions and millions of dollars. So few dollars in anything around pleasure. And that goes for most of our research, but it's especially glaring when you're talking about Black people. And then invitation 5, Black people have cultural strengths, high pleasure worthy despite racism and stereotypes, and are a value add to how we all understand and embody pleasure, worthiness, and sex positivity. So investigate what mechanisms create and support this self-reported pleasure worthiness among Black people to develop interventions for other people who struggle with their sexual self-concept. What are the things that make us feel, I deserve something good, I deserve pleasure? Understand that enough to translate that to interventions for other groups. So I want to just shout my team out. Team of community partners, Rye Square research team. We are a dope, diverse by age, gender, sexuality, body size, race, ethnicity, SES, all of that. Group of sex educators, psychologists, and researchers, and I'm so grateful to get to be in relationship with this community as I do these studies. Makes it so much more fun. So y'all give them a round of applause, please. Love them so much. And now I'm ready for questions, comments, and contact info right here. Thank you so much.
Hi there. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, I loved your talk, and the 5 invitations were great. Couldn't have come at a better time because we have a JSR editorial board meeting in about an hour.
Oh.
So I really liked those. They were very helpful, and I am sorry about the desk rejects.
Listen.
So I just want to make a few points about JSR. So I'm the current editor.
Yes, come on.
And we are desk rejecting a lot of manuscripts. And I remember when I started as editor back in 2009, I thought I would never desk reject a manuscript. But now that we're receiving over 600 a year, we really need to be looking at, and sometimes it's good studies and papers that would maybe be accepted easily in other journals, but our desk reject rate is about 58%, so it's high. And it has grown. Each year, we're just going up by 50 to 80 manuscripts a year. But I do want to add a few things. So first of all, we welcome qualitative research. And unlike some other sex research journals, we don't have any minimum number. I'm asked that a lot, so it's unfortunate that was listed as a sort of reason in the letter, but we really welcome, and we do publish a lot of qualitative research. We also welcome sex-positive research, and are looking at that. The current annual review editor, Kirsten Mitchell, who sadly isn't here, is next year publishing a couple of reviews on those sex-positive topics. So that's a second thing. The final thing is there is a really good paper coming out, just a plug here, in the next week. And I think it's a wonderful study. I was the editor for a qualitative study of 39 Black women's experiences in taking part in sexual health research.
Yes.
I love the paper. I'll tweet about it. But I really want to thank you for that. And the final thing, I guess, is to say we do have a long way to go. So your percentage there of the number of papers. Shari Dworkin wrote an editorial some years ago about the need for more research on Global South populations as well. So completely acknowledge that. And the last thing I would say is I would invite you and other Black women researchers to invite yourself on the board. I do choose people in part because they ask if they can join. And also similarly, special issues, commentaries on articles, all welcome. But yeah, I loved your hot girl science criteria as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Oh, I don't know. Sorry. Okay. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how parents can help and caregivers, just in general, can promote pleasure worthiness among Black children.
That's a great question. It depends on what their understanding of pleasure worthiness is for themselves. I always say start with the self. So it's really hard to promote healthy sex messages when you're still grappling with and unpacking all the damaging messages that you probably received as a parent. Sometimes you think they're helpful because people gave them to you with the idea that they were helpful. And so being in conversation with sex positive organizations, with groups to learn what that means, why you came to know your sexuality that way, and then sharing that information in developmentally appropriate ways for your kids. So I like sex positive families for that reason. I think about the work they do and how they really break down some of these stereotypes around sexualities and genders and pleasure and masturbation for people across the developmental spectrum, and adults are usually included in that too. So I say start with yourself, and then from that lens you can think through, okay, so at 7, what needs to be said for that person to feel healthy at 10? What other message do I add on to that? And think about it in particular in the context of racism and maybe other intersecting oppressions that they might be experiencing. These are the messages that you're going to get about yourself. These are some of the ways you might be fetishized or objectified that we're going to actively name so that you know you don't have to endorse that in your sexual way of being. Thank you.
Hi.
Hey, I love your outfit.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I call it conference drag.
Come on.
From the spirit of liberation science, I always like to ask researchers, for this big sex study that you are doing right now, what is your biggest dream for what happens once it's completed?
Want to have a conversation with Cardi and Meg. And be like, girl, what did happen when you said this? And share the knowledge and just be on their IG live talking about it. And people being like, oh, what's the next topic going to be? And then they fund me to do a really, really, really big sex study. Like, that's big dream. If I'm just going to say it out loud, and anybody can make it happen, you know. That's what that would look like.
If anyone's in a prayer circle, you heard the request.
You heard the request. And if you understood the assignment, let me know.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank
It's so
you.
validating for I'm pre-tenure, but I'm coming into academia later in life after
Yes.
being a practitioner. And so I want to know, like, how are you incorporating, or if you're considering the, I guess, different subcultures of Black culture? Because even in my research, I notice at times heavily African American. I'm also multi-ethnic, so
Yes.
I'm paying attention to how does this show up for the Caribbean women? How does this show up for continental African women, the second generation? And so I'm wondering, has that come up at all in your
Yes.
research?
Absolutely. So one of my first studies was Black men of Caribbean descent and how they define sexual health. And thinking about pleasure was one of the core constructs that they had in their definition of sexual health. That was actually my dissertation project. And time again, I find that Black sexuality studies need to understand ethnicity as one of those central ways of contextualizing culture, because Black American culture is a different thing than Black Caribbean culture, which is so many cultures, Black African culture, which is so many cultures. And so our sample for this study has some representation of people who are Afro-Latinx and of Caribbean descent, of more recent African descent, and who identify as Black from the United States or from like the North American region. And it'd be interesting to see, we haven't started yet, to analyze the way people understand pleasure according to, or how it relates or correlates with ethnic identity. So I think it's really important. Thank you.
All right. And we have several questions that are coming in through the app. So one of those is, how did folks define pleasure? And do we need different definitions of pleasure to study, taking into account intersectionality?
So one of the papers that's coming down the pipeline is Black people's definitions or constructions of good sex. Pleasure is just one part of it. And so I'm just going to try to run down this list. If you remember some, help me out, Dr. Thorpe. But we've got passionate, and we've got intimate, and we've got orgasmic, and we've got fun, and we've got pleasurable, and we've got loving, we've got nasty. And so I think the way we analyzed those data was, okay, how do Black people who have heterosexual identities and Black people who have queer identities think about good sex differently? How do Black people who identify as trans, who identify as cis women, who identify as cis men think about good sex differently? What are some of the things that they share? Do they rank them differently? So I do think intersectionality is a key way of understanding that. We're actually going to talk about that in our symposium tomorrow. Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much for this talk.
Thank you.
This was very inspiring, actually.
Thank you.
So this is kind of a broader question, and it might also be a question for audience members who might have some input. So I'm from the University of Pittsburgh, and we've been doing curriculum reviews or syllabus reviews and whatnot. To try and make sure that we're including Black voices and voices of color in our materials and in our textbooks and whatnot. And the challenge I've had, because I'm like all for that and I'm really excited to do that, but then I look at journal articles and I'm like, I don't know the background of these people, and I'm curious, like, how, and again, this may not be a question for you, but I would, if you have insights, I'd love to know, like, how do we kind of start to create a culture, and maybe this is being done, where people have like a short bio or somehow identify what their background is, so that somebody like me can identify them and gladly incorporate their voice in what I'm doing.
So that's a great question. So I love the Association of Black Sexologists for that, because they do have like a family yearbook. Join that organization. Women of Color Sexual Health Network has a section of bios, so you can look through and see if they match up with some of the research articles. I'll be looking people up, though. I'm just going to name that. I will go and see who the first author is. And race is very tricky, so you cannot always identify someone by race based on what they look like in their Google Scholar profile. I want to name that. That is a crude way of understanding race, but I still be looking people up. And also, I would say be in community with Black people, so that like if you're in community with Black sexologists, you'll know when they have something coming out. You'll have the type of relationship where you're sharing each other's work already, and then it makes it easier to integrate it into your work. I know there's a book coming out on intersectionality and Black sexual pleasure or sexual health. Probably next year. That will be a great text to add. So I think there's some good stuff coming down the pipeline. There's one on Black sexual performance and Black Sexy coming out by Tracy Gilbert. Those are going to be coming down the pipeline. So there's some great work already existent. Sometimes it's not in public health or psychology or sociology. Sometimes it's in the humanities. So I draw a lot from or multidisciplinary work for that too.
Hello.
Hi.
I am so excited about your talk and about your research. I researched the orgasm gap between cisgender men and women, and I have been so inspired by Black women artists in the way that they talk about pleasure and orgasm, particularly Megan Thee Stallion and the way that she emphasizes oral sex in her lyrics. So in particular, her lyric from Captain Hook, mandatory that I get the head, but no guarantees on the penetration.
And there you go.
Amazing, and I think it's so revolutionary, and I've been wondering myself if these lyrics and these songs coming out, if they're having an impact on lived experiences of folks in terms of the orgasm gap, but in terms of other variables as well. And so I'm wondering what you think about that, and also if you think there's a way to realistically measure that as well.
So I know Nikki Coleman's work, maybe from 2013, I'm trying to remember the year, she talks about how hip hop scripts influence Black women's sexual self-identity, but not thinking about what some of the sexual health outcomes or like sexual behavior outcomes are. So I think that would be a really great next step to ask those questions. Have you listened to these songs, or what do these lyrics mean? And then evaluate what their actual sexual behaviors are. Are they more likely to have oral sex or not? You know, those type of things I think would be a really great investigation.
We'll take another one from our online chat. First, I want to just read a comment from online that's getting all the likes, which is, this is by far one of the best conference sessions I have ever attended. Amazing work. It says, your ability to maintain a conversational tone, make the audience laugh, and bridge science and contemporary culture is unmatched. Thank you for this amazing work. Really. And another question was just, what does the future of hot girl science look like? Can you speak to next directions?
Yes, so Dr. Thorpe and I have a paper coming down the pipeline that kind of goes through the way to do hot girl science and these criteria and elements that we outlined. So cite Black women. And then the big sex study data that we've collected is going to be, you know, we'll be publishing on that for years. And so all of that is done through that paradigm. And hopefully, as we asked earlier, we can get some conversations going with some people who can disseminate it. So I have a cool platform and everything, but, you know, people are not going to read my journal articles in the same way. So having some IG lives about it, some Facebook lives, I'm trying to figure out how to take this talk that I just did and put it on my social media in a way where people who don't have access to conferences or academic journals can still have access to it. So that's what it'll look like. And certainly, we do a lot of community-based work with this. So we work in, right now, one of the schools in Lexington, Kentucky for women or young women who have had their first child while they're in high school, and we translate a lot of that knowledge there. We have had some retreat spaces for Black women who are survivors of sexual assault. We translate the knowledge there. So because I'm a licensed psychologist, I also do a lot of therapy and input some of the work that I do into that space, and certainly community-oriented work. So that's what it'll look like.
We have a couple more minutes. We go until 10:15. So if there are any more questions from the audience, I'll have one more that's coming from online.
Right.
This person says, what guidance do you have to incorporate Black sex-positive pleasure when also holding a space for Black people who have experienced sex negativity and/or sexual trauma?
I think sex positivity is so liberating for people who've experienced sexual trauma in particular. So when we were working with the Black women who survived sexual assault through Ampersand, which is a nonprofit in Kentucky, some of them said that they hadn't even thought about themselves as sexual beings who were capable of pleasure since the assault, since the violence happened. And I think it's really important to indicate that a part of healing, that pathway to healing, is by reclaiming your body as your own and understanding its capacity for pleasure and being really gentle and intentional about that journey, inviting that back in. And so I think it's a healing space to consider the liberation that comes from sexual pleasure. Understanding a spectrum of how people can respond to trauma is also important. So sometimes you can have a compulsory sexual response to trauma, or like a restrictive response, and normalizing all of those is like, typical. And then what that means for your pleasure, just because you're having a lot of sex doesn't mean you're having good sex. Really digging down into that with people and allowing them to process the pain that they continue to hold through a trauma-informed framework while you think about how they invite pleasure back in incrementally.
All right, well,
All
let's
right,
give another
thank you.
huge round of applause.